So, a very warm welcome and a huge good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining us today at the Winpy Edge Masterclass series with Trilegal. Winpy is a not for profit that focuses on enhancing the participation of women across the whole investing ecosystem. Trilegal is one of our founding partners, and we are so excited at the launch of this series where Trilegal is very generously sharing their knowledge and resources with all of Winpy's stakeholders and constituents. This is the first in the series. We have two more sessions coming in, and I am as excited as each of you to hear from Clarence. So, with that, I will hand over the mic to Clarence, who is a partner at Trilegal. And the housekeeping rules are very, very simple. Please keep all your mics off. Please post your questions in the chat box. We will be sharing those questions with Clarence. And hi, VT. VT is our expert investor. He's our visiting professor today. So I will be sharing the questions with Clarence and VT over WhatsApp, and they will try and weave in all your questions during their conversation. And if at the end of the session there are any questions still left, if we have time, we will take those up. But during the session, let's try to be disciplined and keep our mics off. Thank you very much. Over to you, Clarence.
Thanks, Nupur. Thanks for that introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for taking the time for this session, and let's just jump into it. So the topic for this session is term sheets for private equity investments. The intention of this presentation is really just to offer some reference points. What we've done is basically taken the two scenarios that we sent across to you and put them into diagrammatic form along with the questions. But before we jump into the scenarios, I'd like to start off by just giving you some context of what the components of a term sheet are, so that you have some context for the scenario analysis. So term sheet in very simple terms is sort of in most cases a sort of non-binding agreement on at a principal level on the terms at which a private equity investor will invest in the company, in very simple terms. The intention is not to sort of get into great amounts of detail on the specifics of the terms of the investment. It's just to sort of describe the broad parameters. It's non-binding because at that stage, you don't want to commit either way, either accept or to sort of make the investment until you've fully diligence the company and negotiated the terms. Now, any term sheet is really broken up into three parts. There's the portion that deals with the pre-investment related considerations, which is before I invest, I want to ensure that you give me appropriate warranties and representations about your business. Are you paying taxes? Are you complying with law? Do you own your assets? Are you in breach of any of your contracts? Those sorts of things. It also sort of describes the type of instrument, the type of investment that's going to be made. Is it going to be a equity share? Is it going to be a preference share? Is it going to be a convertible debenture? Is it going to be something else? There are also conditions to one investment that one would that are relevant before the investor comes in. Those may be, you have to rectify some non-compliance. You have to make some filing with the regulator. It could be a whole bunch of them. Often these conditions precedent, at least at the term sheet stage, will basically just involve we need to complete a due diligence on the company and our findings need to be addressed. Pricing, that's usually discussed at the term sheet stage. So the price, the valuation of the company at which the investor is coming in is usually something that finds its way into the term sheet. Now, often this can be negotiated later on at the sort of the definitive document stage, but ordinarily you would have sort of pricing negotiated upfront at the term sheet stage. One of the other things that exists at the pre-investment stage is really exclusivity. Now, this is not always the case, but in many term sheets, you'll find investors ask for exclusivity, which is basically that don't go out and negotiate with somebody else. Don't take my term sheet that is potentially offering you an investment in your company and try to shop around for other investors. Give me the right to make the investment exclusively or explore this investment exclusively. Now, this obviously changes a little bit in a late stage company, and we'll come to that when we look at the scenarios. The second part of a term sheet deals with once you're an investor. So once you're an investor in the company, your motivations are really around protecting your investment, growing your investment, and exiting your investment in the future. This is really broken up in many ways into governing the company. So governance rights, which is what can the company do, and what can the company not do without your consent. So there are various versions of this. We'll come into it in the scenario analysis. But basically, you want to have some amount of control as an investor in the company on what the company can and cannot do. This applies to the board, it applies to the management, it applies to the employees of the company. The second thing is really around the founders and their ownership in the company. So typically, private equity investors are investing not just in the business, they're also investing in the founders of the business. So they want those founders to stay invested in the business. They want to ensure that they don't sort of exit the company and leave them with the company, because they're not in the business of running the company. They're in the business of making investments in the company. So these are really what one would typically see in a term sheet as share transfer restrictions, whether by way of a lock-in or a right of first offer or right of first refusal. And we can come into those, we can sort of talk about those terms again in the scenarios. The third thing is you will have in this part of the term sheet is really what sort of exit or monetization rights or expectations do I have when I'm making this investment. And this you will typically find this built into a term sheet. So there'll be a sort of time horizon for any investor. It will say, well, I expect this company to give me an exit in 5 years or 6 years. And this really depends on, this is a matter of negotiation, but it also really depends on the investor's own appetite for staying invested in this company for a long period of time. So that is typically negotiated at the term sheet stage. There are some standard.
I love you.
Hello. Okay, I'll just continue. Sorry, I'm not sure who that was. As far as exit rights are concerned, there are some standard ones around this, including IPOs or trade sales, or even a drag along right in certain circumstances. But we can again discuss that in more detail. The idea here with exit rights is really how does an investor ensure that they can get out of the company and get their money for it. And finally, you will have provisions around events of default, where investors are concerned that the company or the founders are in breach of their contractual obligations, and the founders and the investor needs to have a way to get its money out, get its, if the value has gone up, to get that additional value out as well, and to do it efficiently. Finally, the term sheet will have provisions around confidentiality, which will basically say this could cover two things. One is this deal itself should be kept confidential, and the other is more akin to what you will see in a non-disclosure agreement, which is any information that's provided to the investor should be kept confidential. Now, there is a reason why companies will want this, because at least a lot of tech companies, and frankly, this applies across businesses. Their business information, their business sort of working models are often proprietary and often are a key sort of driver of their business. And that information is being provided to the investor. Now, if everyone plays by the rules, that information will not be misused. But the idea for at least the company is to ensure that when they're providing this information to the investor as part of the due diligence, the information is not misused for any other purpose, and is used only for this investment. You'll also have provisions in the term sheet around how do you deal with disputes, and this is governing law. Governing law, confidentiality, exclusivity are typically binding provisions, which means these are actually enforceable rights in the term sheet, while the rest of it are non-binding provisions. This only really deals with how do you deal with disputes on the term sheet. Finally, you have expenses, where often the company agrees that it will reimburse the costs of doing the diligence or costs of negotiating the document that the investor incurs. Sometimes this may be a split of the cost. Often it is borne entirely by the company out of the investment proceeds effectively. And finally, term sheets will also have, not necessarily always, but very often will have sort of a timeline to sort of get the deal done. That may also not be binding in the term sheet, but it is intended to set a path for the deal to get consummated. So that's really what a term sheet is. Just to summarize again, there are three parts: pre-investment, post-investment, other provisions, and all of these need to be kept in mind when negotiating a term sheet for the two scenarios. Now, I'll move on to the two scenarios, and I'll also ask VT to jump in from a commercial perspective. The two scenarios are really an early stage private equity investment into a company, and the second one is really a late stage private equity investment into a company. Now, there are some significant differences between the two. In very simple terms, the general bouquet of rights may be largely the same, but the way they're applied and the way they're modified in both situations differ significantly. So let's deal with scenario one, which is probably the easier one, which is an early stage private equity investment. In this case, you have a company that has founders, it has some angel investors, it has an early stage VC fund, it has some employees who hold ESOPs, and a private equity investor is looking at taking a 22% stake. It's not a small stake, it's not a very, very large stake, but it is a meaningful stake. Now, the question is, I guess the first question that one has to ask is, how do I take this stake? Should I take it as equity or preference shares? And often, at least in the Indian context, investors at this stage look to take preference shares. Now, preference shares offer a couple of benefits. One is they often have the right to be converted, and I'll try to add in the differences where the investors are non-resident versus investors are resident. But let's just first deal with on the basis that the investor is an Indian resident private equity fund. So preference shares allow an investor to have the right to convert them into equity, and that conversion ratio can be sort of modified on an ongoing basis. So it allows the investor some amount of flexibility to determine what those preference shares represent in terms of underlying equity shares. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant because how many preference shares I own as a function of the overall equity shares of the company, which is on the basis that the preference shares are converted into equity, really determine my ownership. Now, as an investor coming in, I may have two or three considerations. One is, I'm putting money into this company as an investor. Tomorrow, if this company goes belly up, I want to get my money out before the equity shareholders get their money. Putting money as preference shares offers me that benefit because under law, I am superior to them. Secondly, preference shares, by virtue of this conversion benefit, also allow me a convenient way of modifying my ownership in the company in the event of certain sort of untoward events. So for instance, tomorrow the company's value falls to the floor. I want my preference shares to represent more in the company because I invested at a higher price, but the company should sort of make me good because the value has fallen. The preference shares allow me that flexibility. And how this will play out, we'll come to. But that preference shares allows me that flexibility. The third thing that preference shares allow a resident investor is potentially a right of redemption. It means they can get money out of the company by the company simply paying them back the money and redeeming their shares. This is not available if the investors are not resident. So when negotiating a term sheet, this is something that you should keep in mind. You can't redeem your preference shares. As far as, let's jump into the next bit, which is really what gets negotiated quite a bit, which is the governance rights in a company as an investor. Now, as somebody who's taking a 22% stake in the company, I clearly want some sort of I want some control over the operations of the company, but I don't want to control the company. And it's a sort of important distinction here. I'm a financial investor. I have to take a stake and I need to protect my investment. but I'm not going to get into the day-to-day running of the company. Now, what does it really translate into from the perspective of a term sheet? For the term sheet stage, I will negotiate basic rights. I will say, I want a seat on the board, and I want a seat on every committee of the board. I may also want an additional observer right because I want a second person also who's my representative around, maybe at a board or a committee level, but who's not voting, but is around to basically potentially champion my case. I may want the ability to say no, just no, effectively a veto right on certain decisions of the company. So, for instance, and this list of the kinds of veto rights that exist is highly negotiated, but all in all, it ends up with it covers sort of similar subjects. It covers capital raising, it covers debt raising, it covers dividend, it covers mergers and amalgamations, buybacks, any sale of the business, any significant capital investments, any significant hiring of employees with high compensation, any change to the compensation of founders. These are some examples of things that are picked up as part of governance rights. And these are, very, very, some of this is standard and is asked for usually. Some of this, well, it depends on a case-to-case basis. VT, at this stage, do you want to add anything on the governance piece at an early stage?
Maybe I can just add, not on the specifics. I think Clarence, I think you've covered many of them. I think one of the things to remember is while they all look like rights and they're usually called affirmative rights, I think you must remember the reason that they exist is because any investor recognizes that they're coming in as a minority investor in a company, and the rights and powers of a majority shareholder in Indian law is quite high. And therefore, most of the rights, while they may be worded with words like veto, etc., are really meant to protect your interest. And really think of it as minority protection rights. That is typically the spirit with which at least much of the negotiation is done and much of the rights are drafted. On the structure itself, I think Clarence was absolutely right. I think the reason you normally do through a preference share is because it just becomes very difficult otherwise to execute some of the rights in India, rights related to, like what Clarence said, liquidation preference, or suppose you have an investment which is structured, which means the valuation depends upon company performance or can even move by plus minus 10%. I think the Indian company law is very strict on issuance of equity shares, even in private companies. So the extent of regulation is very microscopic, which means that it is really, it's very hard to do that. And that is one of the reasons why you will see that almost all investments, at least I have seen and I've been a part of in my investment career, has been in preference shares, simply because it's just easier to negotiate. And tomorrow, if you need to bring in some of these provisions, which are not really desirable, but let's say suppose you want to, it just becomes much easier to do it if you had a preference share. But that's really it. I think that's the reason for the preference share, and the way you should think about all the rights is really because the majority shareholder in India has sweeping rights, and therefore and some of those rights in India are also driven by thresholds. Like in India, if a private investor owns 26%, there are different rights. If they own 10%, there are different rights. But that's not typically how in investing you may end up at. You may end up at 18% shareholding. So what does it mean, and what rights should you have? And the law by itself doesn't give you rights, which is why you often negotiate them and try to kind of lock them in. And these are pretty, while they are standard, they are the definition of what is standard keeps changing. But I would say it's the spirit is to say, is there a chance that as a shareholder I will get I will be treated unfairly, and you're trying to find a way to stop being treated unfairly. That's really the spirit of most of these rights.
Yeah, thanks, VT. Let me just contrast this with a late stage, with the late stage example, just instead of redoing it when we do the late stage example. So in a late stage situation, some of these things change, simply because you are not the only investor in the company. You may be one of, say, 20 investors in the company. Your stake in the company may come down significantly. there may be other significant investors who are already driving the business. The founders may not be in majority ownership of the company. They may themselves be minority holders of the company. The company may have achieved a significant level of maturity, both in the nature of its business and in the nature of its operations, governance, protocols, and all of that. So when entering at a late stage, you have to deal with sort of the reality of the company as is and what's really being put on offer. Now, for instance, we have seen a lot of late stage investments happen in the form of equity, for instance, because that's what the company is offering. It's saying, well, we don't want to offer preference shares. We want to offer equity because we expect to do an IPO very soon. We don't want to go down the whole preference share route and create another class of preference shares. We just want to raise equity. It may also be in a regulated sector. For instance, if it's an NBFC or something, it will say, well, we don't want to go down and create another class of preference shares. Let's just do equity. We will raise the money as equity. It's useful for our capital and our borrowing limits. And that's really what's on offer. So when you do a round at that stage, you are negotiating for equity. From a governance perspective, while in an early stage, what you might get is director seat, observer seat, a veto right for yourself, and potentially a greater amount of visibility on every single action the company is doing. When you come in at a late stage, it may not be feasible for the company also to give you some of these things. So for instance, the company may already have a very large board with investors who hold larger stakes than you. In which case the company will tell you, well, we can't give you a board seat, but we can give you an observer seat. Or they may not even give you an observer seat. The company may also say, well, we can't give every single of our 12 or 20 investors an individual veto right because it will stop the company from doing business. If one person doesn't agree, we can't make decisions. So therefore, we have to change that construct now. And everything has to happen by some majority of these investors. Whether it's 60%, 70%, different matters may attract different levels of majority consent. So if it's like a very significant matter, like winding up the company, you may want a much higher level of consent. Or for instance, if it is a matter that says, yes, we can sell the company at a price that's lower than the price at which you paid to come into the company, then yes, you may want some specific protection. But beyond that, you might sort of end up with being part of a larger pool of people, which is a majority, and be bound by the decisions of the majority. That's usually what happens in a late stage versus an early stage. VT, you want to add here, or should I move on to the share transfer pieces?
I think we can move on. I think the late stage one, I just want to add one thing. I think, but I guess by later stage clients, you're really referring to a company which is kind of grown up and really poised to go public, or poised to have a liquidity event, and not necessarily the size or stage of the company. I think there obviously, you do end up getting minimal rights, especially if it's a company which is almost thinking of it as a pre-IPO round and does not want too many encumbrances. But these kind of rights are normally a bull market phenomenon. It's very unusual to see a private equity firm coming in and buying pure equity shares in a late stage company. It is usually a bull market phenomenon, and a phenomenon where genuinely the investor is either seeing very low risk and the company is kind of saying, I have too many choices, so I really don't want this money. But otherwise, I would say in most cases, the first set of conversation that Clarence had is probably what holds, in at least in most private investments. Go on.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit, which is really the protective rights in the form of preemption, ROFR, ROFO, lock-in, tag. Now, I'll try to unpack each of these things in very simple terms. Preemption, in very simple terms, is I hold 22% of the company. The company is raising more capital. I want to be able to contribute to that raise to maintain my stakeholding in the company. There is another version of this which could say that if you're raising capital, you need the company first. But often you end up with this: I can contribute enough to maintain my stakeholding. The second one over here is founder lock-in. Now this is really a different concern. We don't want the founders in the company, now that the company has grown in value, to try to sell their shares. and monetize their investment. We want them to continue to be invested in the company and invested in the growth and the value of the company, because we are invested in the founders. So often you will find that if you as an investor have a exit and expectation of 5 years, you will ask the founders to be locked in for 5 years, at least upfront. The founders may negotiate a lower number. They may say, well, some percentage of our stake should be freed up, which we can, move around for estate planning purposes and so on. But in general, you'd want them tied up. Now, as this period grows in subsequent rounds, founders may say, well, we can't keep being locked in forever. So we need to have some sort of flexibility. Now, this is again a negotiated point, but then we come to the next form of share transfer restriction, which is right of first refusal or right of first offer. Now, I know these are quite wordy phrases, but in very simple terms, right of first offer is if the founder wants to sell his shares, he needs to first come to the investor and say, I want to sell my shares. Make me an offer. The investor has a choice if he wants to make the offer or not. If he chooses to make an offer, then the founder again has the right to either accept the offer or not accept the offer. If he doesn't accept the offer, he can sell to somebody at a higher price. That's in very simple terms what a right of first offer is. Right of first refusal is a little better for the investor because it's basically a price match right. So the founder comes to the investor and says, I want to sell my shares, and here's the price at which I want to sell my shares. If you want to take them, here's the price at which you can take. From an investor's perspective, it's generally better to negotiate and ask for a offer or a right of first refusal. Founder's perspective, right of first offer tends to be a little better. Tag along right, and so tag along right is really sort of complementary to a situation of a founder selling their shares. Basically, as an investor, what you're saying is, I don't want to stay invested in the company if you are exiting. So if you are selling your shares, I need to participate in that sale as well. Now, tag has two types. One is a proportionate tag, which is basically if you're selling 5% of your shares, I can sell 5% of my shares to the same buyer. Full tag is basically, if you're, irrespective of what you're selling, I get to sell all my shares to that buyer. And you can't sell unless the buyer is buying my shares. I'll stop here because these are really the share transfer restrictions. This is also negotiated at the term sheet stage, and it is pretty common to get most of these, at least at an early stage. And it may not be fully fleshed out in the term sheet. So at the term sheet stage, you may literally just say the investor will be entitled to customary preemption, and I've not covered anti-dilution, but preemption and anti-dilution rights, and the founders will be subject to a 5-year lock-in, and thereafter any transfer will be subject to a ROFR and a tag. That's it. That's what the term sheet may say. A more detailed term sheet may go into more specifics of these provisions. But again, that's really a point of negotiation, the sort of mode of formulation of the term sheet. You are free at the term sheet stage to get into as much detail as you want, but generally, the term sheet is intended to be a principal level agreement. So you'd rather punt this on to sort of more detailed discussions at the time you're sort of negotiating agreements. I'll stop here. VT, do you want to add anything to these?
Just two things. One is that I think my advice to both investors and founders would be, at least at this stage on the key protective rights, to definitely spell them out at the term sheet stage. Because if there is something that is truly bothersome in anyone's head, you should get it clarified, because otherwise you'll be wasting a lot of time. And some of these rights, for some of the firms, could be walkaway rights. For example, something like a tag where you're expecting that if the founder sells, you will attach your shares, or a basically pref, may be very critical for the investor, and therefore if you are either unwilling or for whatever reason you've not thought about it, it's important to think about it. You'll waste a lot less time. I think the only thing, other point I'd like to add to what Clarence said, is some of these rights are two-edged. So for example, right of first refusal is a favorite of mine. While on the one hand, it does give the investor the right to wait for a price discovery. It's like literally saying that, look, you go and find a price and then I have a right to back it at any point of time. The disadvantage is also sometimes that if all investors know that you have a ROFR, you may not get a fully discovered market price. So it's not necessary when you're, I don't know how many of the participants are investors versus potential founders, but even as an investor, sometimes do think about some of these rights do have a double-edged element to them. While on principle, it looks like it's great to have a right of first refusal. In practice, sometimes if all the other shareholders know that you have a right to refusal and that you will likely to come back and exercise your right, then why bother going through this whole process of trying to find a price and trying to find a conversation with an investor? So some of these are double-edged, so you may need to think about it and not obsess about them and not get locked in. I would say, look, the core, obviously, tag, preference, founder lock-in are critical. Simply because, especially for firms, for whom founders are very important.
Yeah, thanks, VT. Maybe we can talk about a couple of more points here. One is I can pick up on anti-dilution. Anti-dilution is something that sort of finds its way into pretty much every term sheet, whether as a more detailed right or written in very simple terms, which says full ratchet anti-dilution or weighted average anti-dilution. In very simple terms, what anti-dilution means is I've invested in your company at 100 rupees. Tomorrow, if you are raising money at 50 rupees, you need to compensate me for that difference, because I invested on the premise that the company's value is going to go up. Company's value has gone down. I don't want to be disadvantaged as a result. Now, how is this given effect to? There are various ways of interpreting that provision. One of the benefits of the preference share is that it allows you to adjust the conversion ratio downwards. So you can sort of give effect to this anti-dilution right. This is obviously subject to sort of foreign exchange law restrictions, which will limit how much you can adjust it downwards, because foreign exchange restrictions effectively place a floor price. But subject to that, you can use that the preference share, the conversion ratio, to give effect to this protective right. Now, the other thing that's worth talking about here is exit, because this usually finds its way into the term sheet. You will, in your term sheet, usually say when you expect the company to give you an exit. So you will typically say, I want the company to do an initial public offering or do a trade sale within 5 years. And you will also spell out what you expect that IPO to be at. You will say it has to be at some minimum price over your entry price, and the IPO size has to be X amount. So the offer size has to be X amount. Now, at an early stage, you can negotiate and say, well, the offer size should be adequate. In addition to the overall offer size, it should be adequate to accommodate all my shares. But to flip to the other example, in a late stage, you may not be able to do that, simply because your company may be too large. So the offer size may not be large enough to accommodate all your shares, but it could accommodate some of your shares. So that's a point of distinction between an early stage term sheet and a late stage term sheet. But again, this is a commercial negotiation point. You do also, as part of the term sheet, talk about what happens if the company doesn't give you this exit within 5 years. What do? You need to figure out, you need to have some fallback. And those fallbacks are usually negotiated as part of the term sheet. One of the fallbacks may be, you have the right as investors to sell the company, and you have the right to force the founders to sell their shares as well to a buyer that you identify. That's effectively a drag along right. So when people say drag, that's what they really mean. There's another version of this, which basically says, if an exit has not happened, and especially this is particularly popular where you have many investors in the company and potentially some small angel investors as well. Just dragging the founders may not serve your purpose because you want to sell the entire company. So you actually have a drag against everybody. But the drag is exercisable by a certain majority of investors, plus the founder, or may not be the founder, depending on how you've negotiated it. But if it effectively allows you to sell the whole company, because your prospects of getting a buyer for the whole company are much better than your prospects of getting a buyer for 30% of the company or 40% of the company. So that's typically negotiated at this stage. VT, do you want to add here anything?
I just wanted to add, I think, on the on the drag and maybe exit rights, maybe more broadly, right? I think the way I think about exit rights is that it is very hard to really negotiate tight exit rights, because simply because, as Clarence said, the practicality, right? I'm saying, will it be an IPO? Who knows? Especially in early stages, is it 5 years, 7 years? Is it going to be an IPO? Is it going to be a trade sale? It's very hard to negotiate. So therefore, at least my bias is not to worry too much about it, because the practical experience is that in a terrible case, well, let's say where you're really talking about a liquidation preference, or in a great case where you're talking about IPO, I think the reality is that everything gets negotiated at that time. And if the founder says, I will not go public, you really don't have an exit. So I would say that it's more important to agree on the principle in terms of timelines. I think that is valuable. Agreeing to within 5 years, I will try for an IPO. Within 6 years, I will try for a fair process run by a banker. I think that all makes sense. But getting into too much mechanics of it is usually not. I would not urge people to do that, because all these actually do get renegotiated at the time. So at the time of going public, if the market is great, everyone can sell. If the market is bad and the company needs the money, then you probably can only do a primary. So anyway, it's a matter that will eventually have to get decided at that point of time. So, I at least normally don't spend too much time on the mechanics, as long as in principle you broadly agree to trying these three things. It's useful. On the drag side, as Clarence said, I think the important principle is no shareholder, at least no institutional firm, will agree to allow their shares to be encumbered, which is the point I think Clarence was trying to make, saying that in case of a drag where if the founder plus you is not enough to really sell the company, then what do you do, right? And there the practical reality, suggestion I have is, so the drag works only if all investors sell. I think there's no shareholder, unless it's and there's no one in the world who's going to come and buy a company where only 70% shares are available and the remaining 30% are not. Right. And this is actually a very valuable thing for founders to remember, especially when they think about angel rounds, number of angels they have on the cap table, the kind of rights they give to angels. Just remember that if you're saddled with too many decision makers, for every round, this is an exit could be in peril, because you may suddenly find that 90% shareholders are agreeing to sell and remaining 10 are saying I won't. And actual reality has played out where some things have happened, and crazy stuff has had to be endured by founders, because of that. So just remember that. I think in exit, it's very, in principle, the principle is important. Details are anyway negotiated at the end. But you absolutely want to make sure that in situations like drag, the number of parties you have to convince is a manageable number. And if the number increases exponentially, then you will have a problem. So if you're a young founder looking to raise money and you're thinking about angel, be very thoughtful about the kind of investors you're getting on the table. Try to do some background check. And I know money is hard and it's not necessarily easily coming your way, but try to do some background check, because this behavior is usually consistent. You can find out, people who are really not angelic in their behavior and people who are.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vicky. Let's move on. I think the next bit is indemnity. Now, this different investors take different views on how much to negotiate an indemnity at a term sheet stage. We've seen investors wanting to negotiate the indemnity quite a bit upfront and bake it into the term sheet so that there's no further discussion at the final document stage. We've seen other investors who say, well, we will have a customary rep and warranty and indemnity package that is done under the definitive documents. Both exist. So there's no right answer to how much you should negotiate an indemnity at a term sheet stage. It really depends on who the investor is and who the company is. But in very simple terms, what does an indemnity really do? An indemnity effectively says that if I'm in breach of my representations to you, which is the most obvious one that's covered by the indemnity, if I have misrepresented to you, if I've told you a fact that's incorrect, then I will compensate you for the loss. And the indemnity allows you to go beyond conventional court damages. It allows you to say, well, I will compensate you for expenses, claims, lawyers' fees, the whole works. And there are some standard ways in which these indemnities get negotiated across the market. And I know the market sort of evolves, but there's a lot of this that is consistent, at least in the Indian context. And what tends to get carved out of what you can claim from an indemnity is basically remote losses or indirect losses. So if if you were going to make this investment in the company and the representation was wrong, and as a result, you didn't make an investment in another company, and that company did really well, you can't say, well, you, my, I was deprived of those earnings because I made this investment and you made a false representation to me. That is not something that you can get under an indemnity. But you can potentially argue that I invested in this company at a certain value, and this is also negotiated as part of the indemnity package, saying is diminution of value picked up under indemnity. But let's, for the purpose of this discussion, assume it is. I say I invested in this company at a certain value based on some representation that you've made. The reality is, and let's say the representations on your financial statements, turns out that representation is incorrect and your accounts were wrong or miscalculated. Therefore, I have lost value. So I need an indemnity. That's a fair ask. Now, question that one has to ask oneself is, who should be paying this indemnity? Now, often you will, as an investor, you may be dealing with founders who are, first-time entrepreneurs. They may not have large net worth. So really, it's really just a paper, right? Because you're not going to be able to recover anything from them. They may not have value. You may be able to appropriate their holding in this company, but that depends on what that's worth. You may say, well, I can recover from the company itself. Okay, that makes sense. But if you're a significant investor in the company and everybody else is also an investor in the company, and the founders only hold a minority stake, then in a way you're paying yourself, or other investors are paying you. So that's also something to be kept in mind when negotiating indemnities. Obviously, this is something that it differs on a case-to-case basis. But at least these are some of the sort of broad contours that one talks about in indemnity. In addition to this, you will negotiate, you will routinely see caps on indemnity, limitations, how much time can I claim it for, what is the maximum amount, different things for fraud, different things for what's called quote unquote fundamental warranties. All of this gets negotiated more at the definitive document stage and sometimes at the term sheet stage. But it's worth knowing that when you negotiate an indemnity, it's unlikely to be sort of a carte blanche. You're likely to deal with some amount of limitations on your right to recover this. Go ahead, sorry, VT, you wanted to add something here?
No, absolutely. I have a lot to say on indemnity. I think when we talk about indemnity, I think one of the useful things that I have found, and I'm trying to remember who told me this because this insight is not mine, but somebody else's. See, you can never make money on terms. I think as an investor, you can only make money if the company does well. If the company doesn't do well, everything is up for the grabs, and you negotiate it and you lose some money. So nothing in your terms can protect you from a bad investment. I think that's important to keep in mind, especially when you start getting through indemnity clauses. Because one of the things to remember on indemnity is that, and it's often a point of contention between me and our own lawyers when we write term sheets, is the reality of indemnity is that you should always ask your firm who's negotiating with you, saying, how will it actually unfold? So what you will realize very quickly, or at least what I realized very quickly, is that the way it unfolds is that first there should be a misrepresentation. And then you have to prove it. And then you have to go to the great Indian civil courts. And then you have to fight it. And then you have to actually get proof that indeed that representation was misrepresented. And then based on that, a judge will decide, whether this actually holds or not. So therefore, the practical reality of indemnities is that I genuinely don't know of anyone who's gone to court in India and got anything on indemnity. I think therefore it's very important in these things to make sure that as you're thinking through the agreement, protect for extreme cases, fraud, utterly wrong financial statements, and see if you can salvage something. But the moment you feel that it has to go through a long process of court of law, then you must recognize that it's very difficult that you're going to get anything out. And often what I have seen is that in extreme cases where, let's say, for example, there's been a misrepresentation of financial statements and you really want to fire the founder, you're often taking a call at that time saying, what do you do? Because if you want to salvage and protect the investment, then you want to fix the company. If you can't, and you just want to protect your, I don't want to call it reputation, but let's say you say you're done. Then of course, you can file cases against the founder and, have lots of conversation on indemnity, but it's not very practical. So I think on indemnity, at least, My sense is, focus on the essential, focus on the big ones, and don't spend too much time because you cannot make money on indemnity, and it's unlikely that indemnity will also protect you and help you recover your investment.
Thanks, VT. Okay, so I guess that covers the indemnity piece. Let's cover. I know there's another session on due diligence, but we can just talk about how this is dealt with at the term sheet stage. So typically in your term sheet, you are negotiating a term sheet either before the diligence has commenced, or the diligence has commenced, but you're still negotiating the term sheet. The diligence is nowhere close to completion. That's usually where you are when the term sheet is being negotiated. So you will, at a term sheet stage, you will normally see a provision that says this is subject to completion of a satisfactory completion of a due diligence, both legal, tax, and financial. That's a usual condition that's built into any term sheet. Sometimes you would have the company itself provide you with a due diligence report upfront, saying this is, our lawyers have prepared this, and you can do your own diligence, but this is what they have found, and you can use this as a reference point. At which point, you may say that you will undertake a confirmatory due diligence, and this is subject to the completion of that. But you may identify some things from that vendor due diligence itself, that the company provides you, and say, well, let me pick up some of these points that I think are critical at this stage itself in my term sheet. Some regulatory approval, for instance, that's necessary. Or, if that report discloses some serious non-compliance that has to be compounded, I may pick it up at the term sheet stage itself, saying, well, you need to deal with this issue before I put my money into the company. Or if if for instance you're investing in a tech company, and the diligence report says, well, we are not entirely sure if the tech company owns all the IP. It may be owned by the founders. It may be owned by somebody else. It has been borrowed. The company had some employees in the past who contributed to it, but there's no clear transfer of ownership of their IP with the company. That's a big red flag, because the intellectual property is the main value in that business. So you may want to, at the term sheet stage itself, say all of this needs to be dealt with before I put my money into the company. So due diligence and the actual outcome of due diligence may not always be picked up in the term sheet. In fact, very often it isn't. But in these limited circumstances, it often is addressed as part of the term sheet stage. VT, do you want to add anything here?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I would almost say that outside of commercial diligence, which is an understanding of the company, the business prospects, and the market the company is in, and maybe some basic founder reputation check, which you might have done based on your own conversations and networks in the industry, all diligence is ahead of you. So in my mind, at least, term sheet, only after the commitment of a term sheet do most firms invest the time and resources in doing the diligence. Because otherwise, how many conversations and how many real investment opportunities can you realistically evaluate at any point of time? So think of term sheet as a very important gate. Usually after this gate, depending upon the philosophy, stage, and inclination and DNA of the investment firm, most term sheets would convert to actual investment. Of course, the ratio may be 90% or 50%, depending upon what kind of situation it is and what kind of a firm is signing up, etc. But you should almost always expect that the diligence is very important, and you should expect that after the diligence there will be some additions, usually additions, not so much to the term sheet, but to the potentially the legal agreements in the form of CPs and CSs, which are basically conditions that need to be fulfilled by the company either before the money actually goes in or immediately after the money goes in, because for sure there may be things and gaps that you identify as a part of your diligence. So the way I think about term sheet is that it's really the license for the investment team to kind of kickstart all the diligence and spend the money required for that. And for the founder, it's a strong signal that if things go well and whatever has been represented is broadly correct, the investment should happen.
Thanks, VT. Let's move on to the next one, which is confidentiality. Now, in most cases, this is a pretty standard thing, as we discussed also in the early parts of the session. It's really that you keep the deal confidential or the potential deal confidential, and you keep information that's provided to you confidential. Now, sometimes, and this is really an outcome of particular situations, you may have companies that are attracting investment from certain investors who also have competing investments. So they have investments in a competitor of that company. It's a very common thing, at least with large VC funds in India, because they will have invested in the same sector across multiple entities. Now, at the term sheet stage, the company, and this is really done by the company, not by the investor, the company may say, well, we are providing you with this whole bunch of information. We know that you have an investment in another competitor. We need to figure out, when we are providing you this information, how do we deal with the potential risk of this information being misused? So you may find that particular provisions are written into the contract, including who should deal with the information. There should be some Chinese wall. Well, that's not always the case, but who should be dealing with the information at the investor's side, and who should have access to it, and how it should be used, and the sort of prohibitions against misuse get sort of strengthened in this context to sort of protect the company against the investor, on a non-binding term sheet getting hold of this business information and then potentially misusing it. This is really more protection for the company than anything else. Sometimes companies, what they do is, especially in these sorts of circumstances, they sort of offer up the information in parts. So what you will get in the initial stage of the diligence will be some amount of information that does not contain very sensitive commercial data. You may get the sensitive commercial data towards the end of the diligence process, once parties are clear that, at least in principle, clear that the deal is going forward. So that the company has some more comfort in providing that information to you, especially if that information offers them a competitive advantage. So this is something specific that's dealt with as far as confidentiality in the term sheets. VT, you want to add anything else here on confidentiality?
No, please go on.
Okay. So I think the next one, we've talked about term sheets being non-binding. I think as VT as well pointed out, typically at the term sheet stage, you don't want to sign up to something that forces you to make the investment, or as the company forces you to accept the investment, because the terms are not fully fleshed out. So it's really more an indication of interest, which both parties acknowledge, and it sets the ground rules for the negotiation on the larger documents. I think the last point, and this is more a housekeeping point, but it's often asked, are there any particular formalities around signing, executing a term sheet? The answer is, well, no. You don't need to necessarily meet in a room and sign the term sheet together. There are various ways of achieving this. You could, once you've got a final document, it could be circulated in PDF. Each party could print out their respective page. They could sign it and circulate it back. They could also on the email confirm that this is the agreed term sheet. We have no other, this is the executed term sheet agreed by us. It doesn't need to be physically signed to constitute execution. There's no particular need for either party to necessarily put a wetting sign on a piece of paper and say this is executed. However, often for housekeeping purposes and internal sort of tracking purposes, this is usually done, that you will actually have a wetting signed term sheet, just to ensure that everybody has a document that they can say is the signed document, as opposed to having to fish out some email that says this is the signed term sheet. So that really deals with the last one, the formalities on the term sheet. I'm sort of conscious of time. Let me just see if there's something else you can pick up from scenario 2. I think one of the key points that you should pick up on scenario 2 is what happens where you have multiple investors investing in a particular financing round in the company. So that's a sort of key difference between this scenario and the first one. You may have a situation where the company is raising, say, $300 or $400 million, but it's not all coming from one investor. It's coming from, say, 5 investors or 6 investors. Now, obviously, each investor has their own lawyers, has their own motivations, has their own standards, but everybody has to come on board, has to sort of align themselves with a particular deal and get comfortable with the construct of the investment. In addition, they have to also reconcile with the existing position of the company, because the company is raising $400 million, chances are it already has a bunch of investors who already imposed their own standards and conditions and governance rights on the company. So all of this needs to be reconciled. So when negotiating a term sheet in this sort of situation, you will often find that what is generally accepted as market tends to be the sort of thumb rule that is followed. Or you will typically have one investor who is a large contributor in the round. So say there's a $300 million round, somebody is writing $120 million check and everybody else is writing smaller checks. The others will look to the main investor to lead the negotiations. And to the extent that they are not comfortable with something that the lead investor is proposing, they will object to it, or they will say they will want their own position acknowledged and recorded and implemented as part of the deal terms. But otherwise, they will leave it to the lead investor to lead the negotiation and set the terms, and will sort of follow through with them on the terms of the deal. So that's, so if for instance you are the lead investor in the round, you will actually not just have to negotiate the term sheet with the company for yourself. You may also have to play the sort of quarterback role where you will be liaising with the other investors and taking their thoughts as well on the term sheet when sort of proposing the terms of investment to the company. This is not always the case, but it sometimes tends to be more efficient to do it this way. Again, there's no sort of straightjacketed way of this happening. This is one of the ways it happens, but it's a fairly popular way. VT, you want to add something here, because this is really a more commercial and process thing.
Yeah, no, I think this is, I think you captured it right. I think there are many investors, usually there's a pressure to align quickly. So I think people do follow what the lead investor is really expecting and asking in case of a term sheet with many terms. We have even seen a situation where there was a term sheet where there were 3 equal investors, and you are able to quite quickly align behind a practical set of constraints.
Got it. Okay, so thanks, VT. I don't think there's much else on this that we've not already picked up. As far as past round is concerned, typically past rounds, depending on what valuation past rounds were done at and how large those investors are, some of their sort of rights and entitlements will have to be retained, even though the round of investment may be quite large. You may also have, sort of DFI type investors which have their own policy standards that are imposed on the company, and you really can't do much about that. You just have to sort of accept the fact that they've imposed those conditions. Those could be, ESG or anti-corruption related sort of policies that have been imposed on the company, and you as an incoming investor sort of accept that as binding on the company. Sometimes they are negotiated, but often if they've already invested in the company, it's difficult to say, now let's just take it off. Also, most investors are familiar with these sorts of standards. These tend to be global standards, so it doesn't really hold up negotiations in a deal.
Clarence.
Sorry, yeah, I might be a few questions. So otherwise, I just wanted to add one line on this. See, my recommendation, at least my suggestion to founders is, if there's a new round, use this as an opportunity to reset all agreements. And at any point of time, just have one set of shareholder agreements which specify what the company is signing up for. I have seen companies which will have a Series A agreement or a Series B agreement with an investor, and let's say they have another agreement coming up with a new investor and they sign up for a new set of obligations. And while in principle, it does make life easy at that point of time, in practice, it does very hard. It's better to have a unified single shareholder agreement which specifies all the rights for all class of investors. And even if you have to invest a little bit of time to renegotiate older things that you've agreed to with your older investor, it's a useful thing to do, so that at any point of time, there is clarity everywhere on what is the company really signing up for. Over to you, Nupur.
Thanks, VT. No, I just wanted to highlight to Clarence and to you, VT, that we have a bunch of questions, and I have just shared those questions with the two of you on your WhatsApps.
Okay, let's pick one of the easier ones. Why are pref shares treated at par with equity shares, as you mentioned in your first case study? I think the answer is very simple. The pref shares will have preference to the extent of their value. So I've put in X amount of money, and my preference would be to that money and the dividend on it. But obviously, if on a converted basis, the company is worth more, then I'd want to participate in the proportionate upside of the additional value as well. So the idea of the preference is that as far as if the company goes bust, I get my money first. It's not that I only get that much money. The idea is that I share proportionately in the overall growth of the company and the profits of the company, the return from the company. VT, you want to add anything there? I'm trying to pick another question to answer.
No. I think that's good. Preference shares, the only purpose is, as Clarence said, is to give rights. Otherwise, on commercial terms, it's exactly equal to an equity share. So that's the only thing.
Can you explain conversion restriction on pricing limitations for foreign investors? Basically, when you invest in a company, the company has to generate, or you or the company have to get a fair value of the equity share of the company from a chartered accountant. Let's say I'm simplifying it for the purpose of this discussion. Basically, that fair value operates as a floor price for the purposes of your investment, which means that even if you take a preference share and that preference share is convertible into equity shares, and I'll put numbers to this for ease of reference. Let's say each preference share is worth 100 rupees and each preference share converts into one equity share. The fair value of each equity share when you invested was 50 rupees, which means even if you want to change the conversion ratio tomorrow, you cannot change it below 1:2. So today your preference share is worth 100 rupees and it converts into, say, one equity share. If you're and say on a 1:1, but you got a fair value of 50 rupees, which means the maximum you can convert into is 2 equity shares. If tomorrow you were to adjust your conversion rate, you can't make it 3 equity shares, for instance. It can't go down to 30 rupees a share. It can't go down to 20 rupees a share. It's sort of stopped at 50 rupees a share. It can convert at 70 rupees a share. So that's the sort of floor price restriction on conversion. I don't know if that's clear enough, but I'm trying to oversimplify the restriction. VT, you want to add anything there? But
no, I don't want to add, because that's like just think of it as there is a price per share which is specified by RBI based on a bunch of rules, which are very, we still think of all foreign investors as still East India company, and therefore are very nervous around what it can convert at. So it's a really bizarre set of rules, but the rules exist. But the rules are flexible. So, to Clarence's point, it might look like it can only be 30, but it can also be 20, it can also be 10, because it's based on a bunch of assumptions, it'll get signed off by a CA. So just for practical purposes, think of it as there is a lower price limit. There is a lowest possible price limit that is fixed, based on some external numbers. And therefore, theoretically, it can't convert below that. We can take off a few quickly. MSOPs and ESOPs. MSOPs are just management SOPs. ESOPs is employee. So they're same. It's just they're not very different. This is the nomenclature is different. That's all. How much time or detail should one go into term sheet or leave it for definitives? My recommendation is do invest the time in at least going through all the key elements, because Clarence has today effectively talked about all the key elements around it, right? Which is what are stuff around protect rights, what is it around indemnities, what is it around the process. And I would recommend that you do spend the time, because then you don't want to have a basic misunderstanding and then figure out finally in the definitives that you really can't have an agreement. So I think that's that you should not. Why are equity and CCPS taken? I think there is some law, if I remember right, which says if you just have CCPS, I think there is some risk that you may not be able to convert to equity shares if the founder goes rogue. And therefore, I think companies also end up having investors also end up having some number of equity shares. I don't think there's any practical reason for it. I think there is some legal reason for it. Clarence, is that right?
I can add to that. So it's a theory that investors that sort of is across the market, that I cannot attend a shareholder meeting and vote as an ordinary shareholder unless I hold ordinary shares, and therefore I will take one share, and for all my preference shares I will treat it on a sort of as though it's converted basis. It's not strictly necessary. This is something usually done where, instead of convertible preference shares, I'm taking convertible debt. So I take one equity share and I take convertible debt, because debt I cannot vote. I have no voting rights as a debenture holder. So that's because I want to avoid that circumstance, I take some equity shares. But it's not strictly necessary in the context of preference shares. But people still do it. So
I'll take 2 more questions quickly. One is, why do a vendor DD when incoming investors will do it anyway? Great question. You don't have to. Practical reason why some firms do it is, some founders do it is they say, in case you run the risk that, that for whatever reason, the investor will walk away. Then you're left in a situation where you have to find a new investor and again wait for a DD to get completed. Versus if you have a vendor diligence done and a report done, then the diligence timeline for a new investor usually should be lower because it's just a top-up diligence. Or worst case, if he walks away, you can use the same vendor DD report very quickly with another investor. That's one reason for having one. Second is if you have a very competitive situation where 4 or 5 investors are breathing down your neck in a very nice way. You want to have a vendor DD done, you share it, you keep taking more and more investors till the last stage, so that you maximize the probability that the investment will certainly happen. So that's one of the other reasons why some companies do vendor DD, but practically you're right. If you're only going to take one investor to the next stage, which is usually the case, then doing a vendor DD can sometimes feel like a waste of time. ESG clauses, not really, but what you will see in some firms, like we ask for ESG diligence to be done. So we ask for ESG diligence to be done as a part of the diligences that are done in the company. And then as a part of that, then subsequently clauses may get added to the legal agreement. But upfront, at least we don't have the clauses in the term sheet. At least I have not seen. If a PE has a portfolio company in the same sector and the potential company doesn't want to share the info, how to deal with this? Great question. I think you'll have to believe that the confidentiality holds. And you may request, some PE firms will have a policy where at least a different partner shows up if it's a company competing in the same area and doing exactly the same thing. It is also the practical reason why, at least in the early investing, venture firm, early investing, it's usually very hard to invest in too many companies competing in the same space, because this is a problem. It is a real problem. And I'm acutely sensitive to it, especially in the early stages. But you have to rely on confidentiality and you have to rely on reputation. I don't think there is a legal way of making sure that you can get comfortable. Has the ESOP standard increased in the last couple of years? Not really. I've typically seen pools of 10% getting created at the early stages and maybe 3% at the later stages, but I haven't seen any big change.
I think one of the things on ESOPs is, phantom ESOPs have become more popular. So instead of just getting actual shares, you basically get a right to be paid cash equivalent to a value of shares.
Which are even worse. This is like talk of 3D founders. I'm like, you're only getting 3% and now you want to have 3% phantom. But unfortunately the newspapers don't reflect this reality. So please don't get carried away. ESOP standards are unfortunately exactly where they were, 10, 15 years ago.
Term sheet different for a strategic investment. You want to take it, VT?
Yes, I think yes, it is, because you do because here you're very sensitive as a company, especially I'm assuming by strategic you mean another company, right? So imagine a competitor is buying you, or a large shareholder is buying you, or a firm is buying you. I think you're even more sensitive. So sometimes I've seen people insist on binding term sheets. And insist that you get a binding term sheet, which means a lot more work has to go. The term sheet is much more detailed. It almost is close to definitive documentation. And I have seen that. I've seen that both in the case, I remember many years ago when Winnie Cosmetics was bought by Reckitt Benckiser. Obviously, we had binding term sheets from 2 strategics at that point of time. So a lot more detailed, because you are very nervous sharing information, all your information, before you get a binding term sheet. So you will not probably have a light term sheet where a proper diligence happens and a detailed diligence documents after that. It's much more detailed.
Yeah, I think that picks up most of the questions.
Yeah, I think we've done a good job. Any different tier 1 VC? Rest, not really. I would say term sheets differ by firm reputations. And that's really the only thing. There are firms which are painful and the firms that are light. So just go by reputation on this. It is really, I found it harder to categorize, in terms of term sheets. Thank you.
So thank you once again. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Nupur. Thank you. Thanks, VT. Thank you.